listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, my name is Uwe Schulte, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this episode of our series Let's Talk Sustainable Business, which is brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I'm welcoming back Shamini Harrington, Vice President Climate Change at Sasol and Presidential Climate Change Commissioner for South Africa. In our last episode, Shamini gave an overview of the challenges for Sasol being a historically fossil fuel-based company to transition to net zero, and we started to talk about just transition. Welcome back, Shamini. You explained last time the net zero plan of Sasol. Could you please briefly remind us what we heard from you the last time?
Wonderful, Uwe. Really happy to be here again to give you an overview of Future Sasol. So in a nutshell, what we are talking about is a net zero ambition that's enshrined within a strategy called Future Sasol. We have a few milestones that we've put forward. The key one is a 30% reduction by 2030 for our energy business and chemicals business focusing on greenhouse gas emissions. And what we want to do is repurpose our existing assets to be sustainable in a low carbon future. Today, they process fossil fuels. We want to utilize sustainable feedstocks, green hydrogen, and utilize the same assets in a different way to produce sustainable aviation fuels and sustainable chemicals. We, of course, want to do this in a just and equitable manner. So we are really focusing on a just transition of our existing assets. And of course, this extends to communities, our people, employees, as well as the supply chain. So very exciting, but a lot of work ahead of us, Uwe.
Yeah, that definitely is quite a challenge, but it looks like an ambitious, but at the same time possible plan that is very encouraging. Let's. Last time we only scratched the surface on just transition, and that is really such an important subject. Let's dive a little bit deeper. You have developed several principles for just transition. Could you explain what they are, and maybe you have a couple of examples?
Yes, Uwe. So, the just transition is something new in terms of every country and every company. In different places, it will be different in how you think about the just transition, what the nuances are, what the impacts are. But ultimately, what it really means is you need to inform or encompass a few key principles. And so I'd like to say that these are our principles, that we've really made it our own, but it really is adapted from existing literature around what a just transition should entail, and also from engagements with communities where we operate. And some of the key things that really underpins our just transition: inclusivity. I can't emphasize that one enough. It really focuses on making sure that we are engaging through the process right from the get-go in trying to understand stakeholder needs and wants. I mean, no one wants to be told how to live their lives, or where to live for that matter, or what their livelihoods will be. People should be empowered to be the owners of the transition and also what they are going through. And really, we're focusing on that. We're trying to bring into the discussion stakeholder wants and needs right from the get-go. Another key one is that the just transition is not divorced from the national just transition. Ours certainly isn't. In the South African context, it needs to be done in tandem with how different companies are operating and moving towards a low carbon future. And so in this way, you can get economies of scale. So one of the key things that we're looking at is ensuring alignment with national approaches, national policies. Another key one we're looking at is, of course, alignment to Future Sasol. We are looking at skills development in alignment with green hydrogen, renewable energy, because these are key components of our Future Sasol strategy. So when we think about reskilling, redeployment, it is obviously with a bias to how we're looking at Future Sasol. And of course, some of the other ones is to prioritize impacted communities, stakeholders, employees. That is our key priority, but that's not to exclude anyone else. We want to really start there because you've got to take this in small bite-sized chunks. Otherwise, you are really not going to be able to give the attention where the attention is required. And then, of course, a key one that we are looking at is partnerships. I mentioned a little bit about the policy alignment, national government, other companies, but really we want to get economies of scale. And to be able to scale that, you need more people part of an ecosystem of change. And so if you're looking at agricultural projects to absorb jobs or to create new opportunities, you want to get more parties involved. We've partnered with various people to be able to achieve this. One of the key platforms is Impact Catalyst, with other companies in South Africa, but we can talk a little bit more about that. That's really, in a nutshell, some of the key principles we're focusing on.
Now that's something that we should explore in a second, but I would like to understand a little bit better the elements that you are actively pursuing at the moment. So you talked about capability building. What I understand is, if someone in your remit, one of your employees, or even a supplier, they were very much engaged in a process that was coal-based. And what you're now saying is we want to go to different sources of carbon, and we want to renewable sources of carbon and renewable energy, which requires a different skill set. And I don't know whether it needs more jobs, less jobs, but how do you actually in practice approach that?
So it starts with, for us, looking at the initiatives we have on the go already. So, for example, we've got bursary schemes. We've got one of the largest bursary schemes in Southern Africa. And what we are looking to do is redirect that to these new areas that are contained within Future Sasol. So green hydrogen, what skill sets would be required there? How do you tailor the university programs, the TVET colleges, which is the technical colleges, to these new skills and these new requirements? A key component of green hydrogen is renewables. But let's think about construction type jobs to actually put the renewable farms up. But also, how do you assemble these things in country? How do you ensure that you set up these plants in country? A lot of the supply chains don't exist in Africa or South Africa, for that matter. It exists elsewhere in the world. So there's opportunities around bringing that here. We're also looking at, sort of entrepreneurship. How do you look at the programs we have today, which we do, focused on entrepreneurship in maybe farming, etc., to see if that can become a new opportunity area for the areas where we operate. So how do we train people that used to be in mining into farming for food security? Could Mpumalanga, where we are operating today, which is coal-based, become the new, food capital that supplies food globally? These are challenges that we are trying to address through opportunities. Climate change presents both opportunities and risks. As seasons are changing, as weather patterns are changing, certain areas that were not farming activities are now becoming. So how do you utilize that knowledge to then look at the just transition in a better way? So that's what we're talking about. It's not always directly in alignment with Future Sasol, but certainly also in alignment with the strategies government is putting in place, as well as what the local communities are saying can be done.
I understand that, but that requires, of course, additional investment in people from your side. How can you, convince your CFO that this is something that needs doing?
So it's not about necessarily convincing the CFO. This is a commitment that the company has put in place. It is part and parcel of Future Sasol. And, there's a little bit of a nuance in terms of how we operate in certain countries. Corporates, I think I might have mentioned this in the first podcast, is that corporates in a lot of developing countries, it's about the social license to operate. Not that it's not important anywhere else, but in South Africa particularly, our corporate reach extends beyond just, returning, getting shareholder returns. It's also about service delivery, about maintaining the areas we operate, looking at infrastructure development, because you need to partner with the private sector, public and private sector, to be able to come together to grow the economy. So these are things that we already, in terms of how we think about our future world and our future operations, we have to build in. The just transition is very clearly not supposed to exacerbate the issues we face in South Africa. And South Africa faces very pronounced issues around poverty, unemployment. So it's incumbent, it's almost a responsibility for how we are going to operate in the future to think broadly about people, planet, and profit. This is really underscored all of the Future Sasol strategy. It's how we think about things. We've even chosen opportunities around decarbonization that were not as profitable because it had a strong people lens to it. And that's what we have to do in terms of where we operate. It requires us to do so.
Are you going to use certain performance indicators to measure whether these efforts you're making actually are fruitful?
Yes, that's a key component of our just transition. And we actually disclosed about it this year in our Climate Change Report 2022, where we clearly indicated that we would have this whole process needing to be driven by data, number one. And then number two, performance and tracking, which would have to be defined through KPIs. How many jobs you create, what are the opportunities, how many people have been skilled. And in fact, Sasol's been tracking a number of these metrics already, just part of our people focus within just broadly the company and how we operate around sustainability. It's now about thinking about the metrics that make sense for future Sasol and make sense to track our progress around the just transition. Are we there yet in terms of defining these? No, not yet, Uwe. We are actually at the phase of still developing the roadmap, and then we'll put in place some of the key metrics we want to track.
But it's, of course, important. Only what you measure, you can improve. That's obviously an underlying principle you apply. And I completely get it that you can't do this on your own. I mean, this is a changing environment. Certainly, emphasis is on very different businesses. So you already started talking about the partnerships that you are aiming for, and you call them partnerships for impact, which I find really, really positive, because that's what it's about. It's about impact. Can you explain how do you actually approach that? How do you convince others to join in?
So, the key thing is transparency and communication. We are in constant discussions with our supply chain partners, with other industry in South Africa. You will notice that the Impact Catalyst has other members like Exaro and Anglo. They're actually the founding members. And every one of these companies is also undergoing a just transition in one shape, way, form, or the other. So that is actually happening. So we have a common goal. And I must say, in South Africa's transition and putting forward a target for COP26 last year, business came together in a way that probably we haven't seen before, with this very clear support for the new NDC, which made the discussions about how we're going to transition, where the opportunities for scale and pace to be achieved, a little bit more easier to get going. Sasol took on the role last year already, where our CEO made our announcements around Future Sasol. We said we want to be an energy champion. And through that, we actually pulled together something called the Energy Council, which has now a wide membership base across the different companies, some big emitters, some mining companies, some smaller focused low carbon technology providers, which offers a platform for us to have those conversations about where we can come together for scale to be achieved. And it's progressing really well, and we're providing a lot of views around where that can actually happen. Mpumalanga has been prioritized. So a lot of focus is going there, and the partnerships are focusing there. But just in terms of our internal process, we've put in place a partnership framework, and we've got various criteria that we are looking to ensure we meet around who we partner with, why we partner with them, and what we want to achieve from the partnership. And in fact, just recently, even as early as yesterday, we had a partnership announced around green steel, particularly around the Saldanha area, and we've partnered with ArcelorMittal. And our CEO and, actually not the CEO, the EVP, Priscilla Mabalani, for the energy business, partnered with the CEO of ArcelorMittal to announce this big partnership about, changing how we think about steel in the country around the value chain to get to green steel, but also through that process, looking at the ecosystem of change around the areas where ArcelorMittal actually operates. Saldanha Bay, a key area where jobs have been lost. How do we look at that economy and grow that? So there's a just transition lens to all of these things, and we evaluate these partnerships very rigorously with this framework being used as the basis.
You see, I think one of the issues that a lot of people are not realizing, it is relatively easy to paint the picture when everything is lovely. And one day we will be fully in renewable energies, and actually cost will come down once we've done that. But in the meantime, actually costs will go up. And I think that is something that a lot of people are currently struggling with. And then we have crisis going on at the same time, at least in parts of the world, and that exploding inflation isn't helping. So I can visualize that you have a good case for partnerships, but then I see some companies saying, having a knee-jerk reaction, saying, "Yeah, but now isn't the time I have to deal with a crisis." Is that something that you're facing?
So I think, with COVID, it's taught us that, there's opportunities in crises. And I think what we are seeing is very clearly an awareness of the long term. A lot of what we are facing right now, energy prices going up, inflation you spoke about, Uwe, it's short term. We mustn't lose sight of the long term goal. And many companies are on that page. Why? They are doing themselves scenario analysis of how things are changing. We are feeling the impacts of climate change today. So I must say, in the case of how we've been operating, that many of the companies we are engaging with and who have partnered with are still very much on the course to actually see change in the long term. There might be challenges around how capital is allocated in the short term where priorities might have changed, but the long-term partnerships still remain and they still focus on the key opportunities in the space. And I think also, costs come down when you partner. Each one brings something else to the partnership. We're not trying to do everything. We don't claim to be experts in absolutely everything. But if you bring more and more partners together, you will then look at the value chain differently. You're not trying to achieve everything in one go. And you can then compartmentalize and say, this is what I can deliver now, with a view in 2 or 3 years' time coming with more. But at least it keeps the partnership going. It keeps the projects on the go. It allows business cases to be developed. And I think this is what many corporates are seeing. The benefit of partnerships really does reduce costs, as well as then allows you to spread risk.
That is encouraging. When I introduced you, I mentioned that you are the commissioner for the government as well on just transition. What do you tell the South African president what needs doing?
That's an interesting question, Uwe. So maybe I should give some context before I answer that question. So I'm one of the commissioners in South Africa. We have a setup which is called the Presidential Climate Commission. It was set up by the president. It's going to be enacted formally in terms of a climate change bill that's currently going through Parliament, and the Presidential Climate Commission is within that bill going to be formalized as part of the governance of South Africa. Right now, we have, I think, about 20, give or take, commissioners that have been appointed across various constituencies within the country. I form part of the business constituency, but there's NGOs, there's government, there's some ministers that sit as commissioners. And the idea is to bring different perspectives and diverse views around the table in order to find and forge a way forward around very complex, difficult challenges. Climate change being really at the center of that, because it really talks to economies, the fabric of how we are going to operate going forward as business, as well as what the policy landscape is going to look like. So it really allows us to have those tough conversations in a safe environment and really to find a way that we can build a social compact. And that's what we are aiming to do. And this has been sort of cutting edge in my view, because not many developing countries have done this. But the president is leading us. We have a co-chair that he has delegated, and we have the president coming in quite regularly into our meetings to provide steer. And if I were, speaking to him directly, one of the key things that I would put forward is we need to start accelerating the opportunities we see. And we need to now unlock the blockages we see. policy is so critically important to be able to get renewable energy off the ground, which is so important to unlock further opportunities. So I would say rush with urgency to uplift those. Look at how we look at the IRP, ensuring that we get as much renewables on the ground as fast as possible. There's also an urgent issue we are facing as South Africans in energy security. We don't have power 24/7. We have load shedding, what we call it. We shed the load during peak periods so that the grid is still stable. And we are facing this every day. So we have to cook during certain periods. You don't have access to power. And a lot of people are going off the grid, which is not helpful in a situation where you need people on the grid. So I would say look to unlock the urgencies right now to get the policy going, to crowd in finance, to get private sector and public sector to move with urgency around renewable energy. And in doing that, you can also start working towards the long-term vision of net zero by 2050.
And when we look at that, that's the specific South African situation, and there are lots of challenges there, and we didn't even touch on water. That's another big issue, as we all know. But let's step back a little bit and say, what does what you've just said also applies for the other countries in Africa, and does it also apply, let's say, in Europe or in the US?
So I think the energy security issue is a global one we're facing right now. If I think about what's going on in Europe, I was there just a few weeks ago, and I was told that also there's likely to be blackouts, during winter particularly, which is not something that most Europeans are used to at all. So I do think this is something we're facing with the high energy prices. And I think there's a need to look for opportunities. We shouldn't just see this as only risk. There's opportunities here to move to low carbon solutions, renewables to be deployed faster. But I would also say, one of the key things we must be aware of is exactly what I said regarding partnerships. Short-term needs and national security needs must still have a long-term view in how we think about it. The North Star and what we're trying to deal with shouldn't change because there's blips that we are seeing. And we need to address the immediate whilst recognizing that we shouldn't lose sight of the future and the long term. So in terms of South Africa, in terms of Africa, I think there's a real need for support. And because of what's going on globally, I think there are challenges around that support being forthcoming. And I think we need to be still real with the fact that if Europe and the other developed countries are facing energy security needs, this is also going to be very pronounced in developing countries. And we need to be aware of the support that's still required and should still be forthcoming. And we shouldn't forego those for the short-term needs to be met. We should be thinking about long-term, medium-term, and how we're going to achieve this together, because collectively this can be done. And each one of us needs the other. And I think that's so, pronounced and came through during COVID. We all a global community, and we need to recognize that if one fails, all fails in what we're trying to achieve.
I'm wondering, you are in South Africa very much focused on coal. If I look at, for example, Nigeria, very much focused on oil, but they will have to go through a similar process, and that's probably even more aggravated than it's in South Africa.
All of the African countries are also going through similar issues, different energy sources, different, dynamics playing out of national circumstances. But I think it just speaks to the special needs of Africa generally. We are, as a continent, highly vulnerable to climate change impacts. We do not have the resources to adapt to these quick and fast, or to respond in a quick way. And we have limited resources to transition. And many African countries, there's discussions going on in Cape Town right now. Africa Energy Week is happening. And some of the key discussions is around how do we use the resources we have while still meeting the climate change ambitions, whilst ensuring that support is forthcoming. So these are the key things that are being discussed. And I think you're quite right. All of these countries that we are speaking about need support, and there are also going to be pronounced just transition implications that need to be addressed with urgency. So when we think about COP27 this year, we should be thinking about financing the special needs of Africa. We should be thinking about how do we ensure a just transition, and what kind of multilateral relationships or arrangements are needed to support this. Do we replicate the JET process, which is the Just Energy Transition Partnership process, something that's been put forward for South Africa but is now being replicated? How do we do this at scale to support other countries in need?
Thank you so much for sharing these things. And before we wrap up, because time flies, I would like to hear from you personally. How optimistic are you that we at least achieve 2 degrees?
So, Uwe, with where we are at, obviously there are days where I'm despondent about what we're seeing, especially when we have the weather impacts hitting us so hard. But there are other days where you see the partnerships and you see the effort that's being put by governments as well as private sector, that I am optimistic. And I do believe that it's going to require more of us coming together, speaking, talking about the difficult things to unlock the space. Am I hopeful? I think we have to be. We really have to be. Otherwise, we are going to really feel the wrath of what it means to have climate change hit us with weather events impacting us. And I think the ability to then adapt is going to be very difficult. So I'm very hopeful. I do think it's going to take us a long time to be able to unlock the technologies needed to see that massive step change and realization of what the Paris Agreement is asking for. And it needs each and every one of us to really say, what is my fair share and how do I play a role in this? And I think we're seeing more of this, just not fast enough.
And if you could give a piece of advice to other companies around the world, from what you learned about your interaction on just transition, what should they be focusing on?
From a decarbonization perspective, as well as a just transition perspective, I think know your operations. Really go out there and understand your emissions. There's so many companies that really haven't even developed inventories. And I think it's so critically important that we need to know what our impact is to be able to set KPIs, to be able to set targets, to understand where the opportunities are at. You're never going to understand the opportunity landscape until you know what the impacts and the risks are. So that's so critically important. And I think that is the first step. And then try to think about what your role is in the bigger scheme of the area where you operate, what that impact is, what your sphere of influence is, and how do you work with the governments where you impact, and broadly in the global community. So I think it starts with the first step. Know your operations and know what you are emitting and what your targets are going to be able to then extend it beyond.
And probably expose that to a couple of scenarios that are possible facing you in the future, I guess.
100%. That's a key component. You start with your understanding first, and then you start looking at strategy. You start looking at governance. You start mainstreaming these issues. Some companies will have small emissions, but huge opportunity for change in terms of facilitating the change for other sectors. But you need to start really with yourself first and then expand that into scenarios and strategy and governance.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Shamini, for providing the background on sustainability roadmap of Sasol and the challenges of just transition, and giving advice on how to go forward and giving us an optimistic perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Uwe. Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, this is, for me, the final episode as host for this podcast series. I would like to thank the listeners for your support, recommending the show to friends and colleagues, and making suggestions and giving feedback. I enjoyed the enlightening and inspiring contributions from our guests very much. Please continue your efforts wherever you are to support a transition to a more just, non-fossil society. Thank you and goodbye.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.